Franklin Hayes had crossed that street 100 times before. Each time he relied on the faint beep from the crosswalk signal and the feel of his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. At 72, he moved slowly but with purpose, his army jacket a little frayed at the cuffs, his cap shadowing a face carved by time and service. He was blind, but not helpless. His independence, hard-earned and fiercely guarded, was one of the few things he still held on to. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in a small American town, the kind where nothing ever seemed to happen. Franklin had just stepped off the curb, humming an old marching tune, when the police cruiser rolled up. One officer, new to the town and unaware of Franklin's condition, mistook his slow movement and unresponsiveness for defiance. His partner shouted, "He's not listening!" The younger officer stepped out, tension rising. "Sir, stop right there. Hands where I can see them." Franklin paused, confused. The voice was sudden, loud, and unfamiliar. He tilted his head, trying to place where the sound had come from. The beeping crosswalk signal had stopped, and the sound of the approaching car tires masked everything else. His hand gripped the cane a little tighter, unsure if the command was even meant for him. "Sir." "Do it now, or I'll deploy the taser." There wasn't time for someone to explain, no time for an onlooker to intervene. The officer pulled the trigger. The electric crackle split the air. Franklin cried out, more in shock than pain, as his body seized and dropped hard to the ground. His cane skittered away, landing uselessly near the storm drain. A woman screamed. A teenager dropped his phone. A man nearby shouted, "He's blind! What are you doing?" The silence that followed was heavier than the impact itself. Franklin lay still, chest rising unevenly, the patches on his jacket catching the morning sun. For a long second, no one moved. In that moment, something changed. The town, so quiet, so safe, had witnessed something unthinkable. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a fracture in trust, a wound torn open not just in a man's body but in the heart of the community. People had seen a veteran fall, not to war, but to misunderstanding, and that was only the beginning. 7 minutes later, help would come. Not from the police, not from the town, but from those who had once stood beside Franklin in battle, and who never forgot what it meant to protect their own. For 7 agonizing minutes, Franklin Hayes remained on the pavement, unmoving, his breath shallow, his dignity shattered. Around him, a small crowd gathered, unsure whether to intervene or keep their distance. Some filmed with trembling hands, others shouted at the officers, demanding answers that never came. The 2 policemen stood frozen, their training overwhelmed by the weight of what they had just done. A veteran lay on the ground, not by enemy fire, but by their own. The murmurs grew louder, the tension thick as smoke. A child clutched her mother's hand and asked, "Why did they hurt him?" No one had an answer. Then, in the distance, a new sound began to rise. A deep, steady rumble, like a storm rolling over the hills. Heads turned toward the horizon. At first it was hard to tell, just the faint noise of engines climbing in power, but soon shapes emerged over the hilltop. Military Humvees, tan, dust-covered, unmistakable, moved in slow formation, their tires crunching the asphalt with measured force. They weren't rushing, they were arriving with purpose. Gasps replaced shouts, phones lowered, eyes widened. At the head of the convoy, a woman stepped out. Crisp uniform, medals that shimmered in the sunlight, a calm, commanding presence. Major Elena Ruiz didn't hesitate. She walked past the stunned onlookers, past the line of police, and knelt beside Franklin. She didn't need to ask who he was. She knew. "Franklin Hayes," she said softly, brushing debris from his sleeve. "You're not alone." The officers began to speak, but Ruiz raised her hand. Not another word. Behind her, the convoy halted in unison, forming a wall across the road. It wasn't a protest. It was a shield. Soldiers climbed out, not with weapons, but with eyes scanning the scene, measuring, witnessing, guarding. A message passed without a single word spoken. This is not how we treat our own. Franklin stirred, eyelids fluttering, pain etched across his brow. He whispered a word. Ruiz leaned close to hear. "Thought I heard tanks." She smiled gently. "Almost, Sergeant. We came as soon as we heard." In 7 minutes, the silence had been replaced by something far stronger than outrage. Solidarity. The kind that doesn't ask for cameras, doesn't speak in hashtags. It simply arrives, stands firm, and refuses to look away. Major Elena Ruiz stayed on one knee beside Franklin, her fingers gently pressed to his neck, feeling the slow, fragile rhythm of his pulse. His breaths were shallow but steady. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease. She rose slowly and turned to face the officers. Her face was calm, too calm, but her eyes burned. "This man fought for you," she said, her voice steady and cold. "And you dropped him like a threat." Neither officer responded. Their mouths opened, but no words came. Around them, the air was still, except for the low idle of the Humvees behind her. Soldiers remained in position, some helping direct civilians away, others standing guard beside the convoy. They weren't here to make noise. They were here to protect. Paramedics arrived, finally allowed through. Ruiz didn't move from Franklin's side until they took over. Even then, her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, as if anchoring him in the moment. Then, one by one, others began to appear. From behind shop doors, from parked cars, from the edge of the growing crowd, they came. Veterans, some still young, others gray and stooped, walking slowly with the weight of memory. They wore their service, old patches on denim jackets, ball caps with unit insignias, dog tags clinking softly as they moved. They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They stood beside Franklin, behind Ruiz. Shoulder to shoulder, a man in his 50s, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, stepped closer and looked down at Franklin with misted eyes. "He saved my life in Fallujah," he whispered. The words weren't meant for anyone in particular, but they carried through the crowd like a prayer. Another nodded. "I watched him carry a wounded kid through mortar fire. Didn't leave until we were all out." And still another, her voice breaking. "He taught me how to walk again after I lost my leg." Stories floated like smoke, invisible but undeniable. "Major." Ruiz stood tall now, her hands behind her back. The officers, once upright and commanding, looked smaller in the shadow of the silent formation. She turned to them one last time. "This man isn't just a veteran, he's family." The weight of that word hung in the air. Franklin was loaded gently into the ambulance, his hand held by a young medic who called him Sir. The convoy didn't move, not yet. They weren't waiting for orders. They were standing watch. Because, in their world, one truth remained unshaken: we don't leave our own. Franklin Hayes was safe now, stabilized and on his way to the hospital, but the convoy didn't budge. Not a single engine revved. Not a tire turned. The soldiers stood at numb ease, but with purpose. Watchful, grounded. They weren't waiting for praise or recognition. They were waiting because something in the air still needed to be mended. Then, one by one, they stepped off the line. A soldier walked to the corner and gently took the arm of an elderly woman, helping her cross the street. Another jogged over to a young mother juggling 2 toddlers and a stroller, shielding her from the sun with a military poncho. Groceries spilled from a broken paper bag on the sidewalk, and without a word, 2 soldiers knelt and repacked every item, handing them back with a quiet nod. The road, once the scene of confusion and harm, had become a place of small, silent kindnesses. Nothing was broadcast. No orders were shouted. It just happened, naturally, like muscle memory. A little boy holding an American flag in one hand and his father's hand in the other tugged away and stepped forward. He looked up at one of the soldiers, eyes wide. "Why are you here?" he asked softly. The soldier crouched down to meet his gaze. He didn't smile or make a joke. He just placed a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Because kindness is our duty, even when the world forgets." Nearby, someone choked back a sob. A teenager wiped tears from her face. An older man removed his cap in quiet respect. No one applauded, but the stillness was its own kind of reverence. And the officers? They stood back, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Their authority felt hollow now, not because anyone had stripped it away, but because something greater had taken its place. A humility they hadn't expected, a truth they couldn't ignore. Slowly, silently, they lowered their heads, not in shame, but in recognition. The convoy had arrived to protect one man, but in doing so, they reminded everyone what protection really meant. It wasn't just standing guard in combat, it was carrying groceries, guiding the weak, showing up when it mattered, and doing it not for glory, but because it was right. One by one, the soldiers continued. No rush, no fanfare, just service. By sunrise the next morning, the town wasn't the same. The story had spread like wildfire, videos shared, headlines written, voices raised. But what people talked about most wasn't the mistake. It wasn't even the taser. It was what came after, the convoy, the soldiers, the small human acts of service that turned a moment of pain into something quietly extraordinary. Cable news ran the footage on loop. Humvees parked across the road, veterans helping strangers cross, a child asking why kindness still mattered. But behind the cameras, something deeper had begun to take root. The mayor held a press conference that morning, eyes heavy with regret. "We failed one of our own," he said plainly. "But this town also remembered who we are." His voice cracked when he added, "And for that we thank our veterans." Later that day, the officer who had tased Franklin requested a private meeting. No reporters, no statements. Just him, Franklin, and a folding chair beside his hospital bed. He said he was sorry. No excuses, no badges. Just a man asking for forgiveness. Franklin, bruised but alert, nodded slowly. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice rasping but firm. "But you showed up to own it. That matters more to me than the mistake." And with that, it was done. Not forgotten, but forgiven. The town didn't want a statue. They didn't hold a parade. They did something simpler, something that would last. They installed a sign at that same crosswalk. Veterans cross here. Stop. See. Honor. The words were plain, but they carried weight. And then something beautiful began to happen. Each day, someone showed up. Not assigned, not scheduled, just people, some veterans, some teenagers, some complete strangers, waiting at that corner to help others cross. They carried umbrellas when it rained. They waved to kids on bikes. They slowed down the rush of the world, just enough to remind everyone what respect looks like. They stood there not because they had to, but because someone once did. And that memory, the sight of a convoy arriving not to fight, but to heal, stayed in the heart of the town like a quiet anthem. A reminder that even in our worst moments, the best of us can still rise, one kindness at a time.